Chapter 181. It was said that pregnancy could affect one's cognitive abilities, and Karen Daly thought that she was really stupid recently. Kevin Kyle had not gone to work in the company these days, but she only realized it today. Kevin Kyle did not go to the company, so Amelia Gray and Nick Black came to the house. The study room at home became their temporary office. After breakfast in the morning, Kevin Kyle accompanied Karen Daly to walk around and then went off to the study room to do his work. Karen Daly was not idle either. Mia Kyle pulled her along to practice her script with her. Mia Kyle's new script was about Cinderella. She said it would be a story that an ordinary girl married into a rich and powerful family through hardships and finally ended up with a male lead. The girl was not born rich, but she had been working hard all the time. At the school's speech meeting, she met the male lead for the first time. So the two of them started a love story with a great disparity in status. When the male lead's family knew the existence of the girl, they felt that the girl was not worthy of the male lead, so they tried their best to break them up. They even threatened the girl with the girl's family. The girl was forced to break up with the male lead. Fortunately, the male lead had a firm mind on the girl. After experiencing all kinds of ups and downs, the hero's family finally acknowledged the girl's good attitude. The male lead married the girl with great glory, which made many people envy her. Mia Kyle had been spoiled by the whole family since she was a child. She had never suffered any grievance. After several times, she still couldn't play a good role, especially with her psychological expressions. It was not perfect. After practicing a few times, Mia Kyle still couldn't reach her goal. She fell on the sofa dejectedly and kicked her leg in anger. "Karen, why can't I play this role well?" Karen Daly said. "Mia Kyle, why don't you put yourself in the shoes of the position of the heroine? Think about it carefully. If you were her, what should you do when you encounter such a thing?" Mia Kyle blurted out, "I think this heroine is so stupid. His family didn't approve of their relationship and wanted them to break up. The hero was suffered such hurt that he almost gave her up. If I were her, I'd just take the bomb and blow up their house. Whoever gets in my way, I will kill them." Hearing Mia Kyle's words, Karen Daly burst into laughter. "Mia, you're talking about your personality, but now you're going to act the heroine in the script. She's different from you when she was born and received a different education since she was a child. Besides, she has not much support. She can only rely on herself no matter what she does." Mia Kyle was born with a silver spoon. If the director wanted her to act like a spoiled young lady of a rich family, she would definitely be able to pick that role up. The identity of the heroine in the script was a life Mia Kyle had never experienced before. It was hard to play. However, Karen Daly was different from Mia Kyle. Karen Daly's family background was similar to that of the female lead, or even worse than that of the female lead. But the only thing that was stronger than the female lead was that she would never break up with Kevin Kyle for the sake of her family. Regardless of the time, her determination to spend the rest of her life with Kevin Kyle was so firm that no one could change it. Hearing Karen Daly's words, Mia Kyle thought it was quite reasonable. She touched her forehead and thought carefully, feeling the life of the heroine with her heart and feeling the helplessness of the heroine. When she practiced with Karen Daly again, Mia Kyle was much more satisfied with her performance. At least, she understood that not everyone in the world was as lucky as her. She was abandoned by her biological parents, and she could meet a family like the Kyle family. She could also win everyone's favor. As for the relationship between her and Neil Brown, the most important thing was not her family's attitude. She believed that if she liked him, her grandfather and parents would definitely agree. The most important thing was Neil Brown's attitude towards her. Thinking of Neil Brown, Mia Kyle gnashed her teeth in anger. That dude knew that she liked him, but he asked her to fall in love with someone else. "Mia Kyle, are you thinking of Neil Brown again?" Karen Daly asked. It was estimated that only Neil Brown could make Mia Kyle react this way, besides Kevin Kyle, who always punished her to learn etiquette and reflect on her misdeeds. "Yeah, I thought of him again. Karen, wait for me for a moment. I'll call him." Mia Kyle took out her mobile phone and called Neil Brown. As soon as the phone was connected, she said in a hurry, "I'm missing you, Neil Brown." "Miss Kyle, the commander is busy. He doesn't have time to pick up your call." Mia Kyle heard a familiar voice came through the phone. It was the Deputy General of Neil Brown. "Since he's busy, please tell him for me. I miss him. I like him. I'll marry him in my life." After that, Mia Kyle hung up the phone. Neil Brown didn't answer her phone. In the future, she would say the same thing no matter who answered his phone. She wanted everyone to know that he was her man. No one else would dare to covet her. Mia Kyle's straightforward attitude really opened up Karen Daly's eyes. She respected Mia Kyle's attitude to pursue true love, but she was worried that Mia Kyle would get hurt. Karen Daly thought for a moment and said, "Mia Kyle, it's not a good idea to blindly entangle with him. First of all, we have to be sure of his attitude towards you and see what he thinks of you. Whether he likes me or not now, he will like me in the end." Mia Kyle was very confident. She was so beautiful and cute, and Neil Brown was not really blind. How could he not like her? Karen Daly said, "Mia Kyle, love is very strange. Sometimes being the best is not enough." Karen Daly was not a meddlesome person. She was worried that Mia Kyle's enthusiasm would be extinguished by Neil Brown. She didn't want Mia Kyle to get hurt, so she hoped that Mia Kyle could always be the happiest girl. That's right. My brother could find someone like you. Love is really a strange thing. In the past, Grandpa Kyle wanted to pair her with Kevin Kyle. As she thought of his cold face, she felt chills again. Madam, Miss, Mr. Ken is here. He said that the young master had asked him to come. Aunt Anne led a man into the house. Mr. Ken? Karen Daly and Mia Kyle looked at the door at the same time. Mrs. Kyle, I haven't seen you for a long time. George's thin and tall figure walked in from outside the house. He had a smile on his face, just like a few months ago when Karen Daly saw him. He was just like a frivolous person. Hello, Mr. Ken. Karen Daly stood up and smiled politely. Aunt Anne, please go upstairs and invite Kevin Kyle downstairs. Actually, I'm here to see you, Mrs. Kyle. It doesn't matter if Matthew is here or not. George's eyes fell on her round belly and said with a smile. The last time I saw you, I haven't heard any good news. I didn't expect to see you again, and your belly is so big. Congratulations. Karen Daly nodded and said with a smile. Thank you, Mr. Ken. Chapter 182. Mr. Ken, you know that my sister-in-law is pregnant. Don't try to hit on her. Mia Kyle jumped out and stood in front of Karen Daly. She didn't want other men to look at her sister-in-law anymore. Mia Kyle always complained about Kevin Kyle and felt that he was not good to her. He cared about everything and was very annoying, but she would still help her brother whenever required. George smiled and said, Aren't you Polaris? I remembered that when you were studying in the United States, you were just a little girl. It's been a few years since we last saw each other, but you've grown taller and prettier. When Kevin Kyle was in college, Mia Kyle was only about 12 years old. At that time, she was very cute and lively. She liked to follow Kevin Kyle, so it was not surprising that George still remembered her. You know me? Mia Kyle stared at George and said, Oh, you are that. A name appeared in her mind. She was about to blurt it out, but she couldn't figure out who it was. Come on, reminded George. So it's you, I remember. Mia Kyle nodded, as if she suddenly realized something. You like to guess the thoughts of the people around you at that time. Do you still want to guess now? George said with a smile. Now it's my job to guess people's thoughts. If I don't guess, there will not be income, so I have to continue to analyze. Watching the two of them talking cheerfully, Karen Daly did not interrupt. Instead, she looked at George quietly. To be honest, she didn't hate George at all. She even felt somewhat intimate with him for some reason. She didn't want to get close to him because he analyzed people's thoughts thoroughly. In front of him, there was almost no privacy at all. If it weren't for the clue he gave her when they met last time, she thought that they should be friends as well. President Kevin, let's arrange what you've told us. Hearing the voice, Karen Daly looked for the sound and saw Kevin Kyle, who was wearing a gray shirt and black trousers, leading Nick Black and Amelia Gray downstairs. They walked behind him and were still talking about work. Kevin Kyle nodded and said, Okay, you can go and do your work first. Matthew, it's been a while. George took the lead in greeting Kevin Kyle. It's been a while. Kevin Kyle nodded coldly. In front of outsiders, he was still arrogant and cold. He added, Aunt Jen, please prepare some tea and meals for me and send them to the reception room. George said, We have been old friends for so many years. Don't bother. Besides, you should know that I don't like eating desserts. Karen likes it very much. Kevin Kyle's answer was very direct, which was to emphasize that he didn't think much of his guest. He didn't prepare it for him, but for his wife. George did not know what to say. As expected, he was still the familiar Matthew. This way, please. Kevin Kyle gestured him. He held Karen Daly's hand and pushed the hair on her forehead behind her ear. You should come with me. Brother, I'll go too. Mia Kyle also wanted to follow him, but she was stopped by Kevin Kyle's cold gaze. She pouted her lips unwillingly and said with dissatisfaction in her heart, Sister-in-law and baby are safe now, but he is still angry with me. In the reception room, Aunt Jen brought some snacks and hot tea. Kevin Kyle picked up the snacks and fed Karen Daly. Eat a little first. George looked at Kevin Kyle in front of him and widened his eyes. Was this really the Matthew he knew? It was hard to believe that the cold man actually had such a gentle and considerate side. George sat opposite him. Kevin Kyle's behavior made Karen Daly feel a little embarrassed to open her mouth. She said, I'm not hungry. If you have something to say, I'd better go out first. Karen, you don't have to go out. The thing we are talking about has something to do with you. The person who spoke was George. This time, he was not addressing her as Mrs. Kyle, but as Karen. Karen Daly also noticed it and looked at him in confusion. Does it have anything to do with me? She didn't contact George privately. He said that it had something to do with her. Was she sick again? Didn't she know? Don't be too nervous. As long as Matthew is here, I won't eat you alive. George still said in a casual tone. However, he was right. As long as Kevin Kyle was here, why should she be worried? After some thoughts, Karen Daly put her hand into Kevin Kyle's palm and let him hold her tightly. No matter when, as long as he stayed with her and held her hand tightly, she would no longer be afraid. These snacks look delicious and I would like to have a taste. George's eyebrows raised slightly, and he said with a smile, Karen Daly, can I have a try? Mr. Ken, please. As the host, Karen Daly felt particularly embarrassed. However, Kevin Kyle did not think so, and George did not think so either. He had known Kevin Kyle for many years, so he knew Kevin Kyle's personality. The more he was polite to him, the stranger he would be to him. George took a piece of snack with his hand and stuffed it into his mouth to eat it. Then he said with a disgusted face, "It's your girl who likes eating sweet food. This is not suitable for us men. Tell me, what do you like to eat? I'll cook for you in the evening," Karen Daly said. "It's best to eat the food prepared by my sister," George said. Karen Daly did not answer and thought that George's words were not clear. "My name is George. I am the eldest son of your biological father, Herbert Ken, so I'm also your half-brother." George suddenly changed his casual attitude and said very seriously, "What?" Karen Daly looked at George in surprise. He looked serious, and it did not seem like he was lying. She looked at Kevin Kyle again. Kevin Kyle held her in his arms and nodded to her. "He is telling the truth. He and I." Karen Daly was so shocked that she couldn't say a word. This thing happened so suddenly that Karen Daly had no mental preparation at all, so she just looked at George Ken and Kevin Kyle. Since Karen Daly knew that she was not Samuel Daly's biological daughter, Karen Daly had been thinking about who her father was and if there were other people in the family. What did they look like? During this period of time, she had thought of a lot of things and never thought that she could meet her own biological brother. Moreover, judging from George's attitude, he didn't despise her. He even accepted her. Every time she saw Kevin Kyle and Mia Kyle, Karen Daly would think that if she had a brother, it would be a wonderful thing that he could take care of her and pamper her. At this moment, her dream came true, but she could not believe it. Chapter 183, Karen Daly was worried that this was just a show that Kevin Kyle and George Ken had put on to fulfill her wish and make her happy. Karen Daly didn't respond for a long time, so Kevin Kyle was a little anxious. Was it too sudden that she couldn't accept it? Kevin Kyle patted Karen Daly's face and said worriedly, "Karen, I'm fine." Karen Daly shook her head and looked at them. After a long time she asked carefully, "Are you sure? Are you sure that George Ken is my half-brother?" They must not give her hope and let her down again. If so, she would rather not hear such news today. "This is absolutely true." George Ken handed a document to Karen Daly and said, "We found this document when we moved and cleaned up Father's relics 2 years ago. That is how we knew that you were my sister. I've also read this document and learned that my father wanted to take you and your mother back to have a new life, but before he could do it, he died in a car accident. So this matter was delayed for more than 20 years. Karen Daly opened the document with a trembling hand. The first thing she saw was a photo of her mother and a man. Her mother in the photo was still very young. She had a sweet and happy smile on her face. She looked so happy. The man next to her was looking at the woman's smiling face. His eyes were thoughtful, but it was not difficult to find the gentleness in his eyes. It was probably only when a man fell in love with a woman that he would have this kind of look. Karen Daly opened the document again and saw a handwritten letter. It was written by a person named Herbert Ken. After reading these documents, Karen Daly was shocked beyond words. It turned out that her mother had such a beautiful relationship, but those beautiful things were all ruined by Samuel Daly, that beast. Her mother swallowed the bitterness alone because she felt that she no longer deserved her childhood sweetheart. She broke up with her lover and married Samuel Daly, the beast, under the pressure of her family. Karen Daly took a deep breath and looked up at George Ken. She opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but she didn't say a word. "Karen, I don't know your thoughts of me, but in my heart, you're always my little sister." George Ken's words were extremely serious. But don't you blame my mother and me?" Karen Daly said cautiously. Even if her mother and Herbert Ken were former lovers, they had broken up with each other. After that, they both married others. Then there wasn't any contact between them. But a few years later, Herbert Ken had a child with his ex again. Usually, the legal wife would not forgive him. Why did George Ken acknowledge her as his sister on behalf of his father? Karen Daly could not understand, but George Ken understood her concerns. He sighed and said, "My parents united with each other because of mutual family benefits. They respected each other like guests after their marriage. Their life was also in harmony. Later, my mother died young because of illness, and my father didn't marry another woman until this thing happened." Kevin Kyle held Karen Daly in his arms and said, "Karen, your mother and your biological father. They were both very nice people. They had never done anything to destroy other people's families." "Well, I understand now." Karen Daly nodded and raised her eyebrows with a smile. "Kevin, thank you. George?" Karen Daly took a deep breath and said with great effort, "Brother, thank you too." She thanked them for bringing such good news to her and let her understand that her birth was not a curse. Her mother and biological father were both good people. "Then can I hug you, Mrs. Kyle?" George Ken got up and restored his usual casual expression. "Of course, Mr. Ken." Karen Daly also stood up and looked at him with a smile. George Ken walked around the table and went to Karen Daly's side. Under the gaze of Kevin Kyle, he hugged Karen Daly and patted her on the back. He said, "Now you have someone to rely on. If Matthew dares to bully you in the future, you can call me. I promise to deal with him for you." Well, I have support now. This sudden feeling of having a family was really happy. Karen Daly smiled genuinely. Karen Daly believed that her mother would be happy for her when she saw her brother reconcile with her. George Ken held Karen Daly in his arms and did not let go. Karen Daly did not leave his arms either. Kevin Kyle, who was on the side, was unhappy. He grabbed Karen Daly back and put his arms around her waist. Karen, you must be hungry. Let's have lunch first. Matthew, I'm her brother. You are jealous even if I hugged her. You're too petty. George Ken shook his head inside again. So what? Kevin Kyle said without any emotion. So what if he was her biological brother? Now Kevin Kyle's wife, he would definitely protect her well. He would never let George Ken, her biological brother, have the chance to show off his care for her. Mr. Kyle, my brother is right, you are too petty. Karen Daly also stood on George Ken's side. Now that she had a brother, she could occasionally be capricious and bully Kevin Kyle. Kevin Kyle's face was cold and he was not happy. Looking at Kevin Kyle's dejected expression, George Ken laughed heartily. Matthew, I can't believe things like this would happen to you too. You finally met your nemesis. When Kevin Kyle went to school, he often bullied them. Now there was someone who could deal with him. This feeling was absolutely cool. Kevin Kyle put his hand on George Ken's shoulder. With a slight push, he heard the bone crackling. Then he heard George Ken scream. Matthew, I was wrong. I was really wrong. You are a magnanimous man. Please spare me. I won't laugh at you. I won't laugh at you anymore. How could he forget that Kevin Kyle was good at more than 3 kinds of martial arts? An unhappy Kevin Kyle was definitely not a kind man. Karen Daly did not know what had happened. She looked at the two of them with a confused look and asked, What kind of riddles are you saying? Kevin Kyle took back his hand and rubbed her head. It's okay. I'll treat Mr. Ken to a big meal later. When he spoke, there was a faint smile in Kevin Kyle's eyes. He seemed to be very happy. Karen Daly was happy too and nodded heavily. Okay, let's treat my brother to a big meal together. The couple walked happily at the front. Behind them, George Ken was still in deep pain that he almost fell to the ground. He reached out his hand and touched the part of his shoulder, which Kevin Kyle had just squeezed. It was so painful that he gritted his teeth. He finally understood that it was fine to provoke anyone, but just not Kevin Kyle. Although Kevin Kyle always pretended to be aloof and emotionless. But when he became fierce, he could be a devil who killed others without blinking eyes. However, he was also very happy. Kevin Kyle would hurt anyone except Karen Daly, who was loved deeply by Kevin Kyle. As Karen Daly's biological brother, he was happy. Chapter 184. After the kidnapping incident, Kevin Kyle started to work at home so he could have more time to take care of Karen Daly. As for Karen Daly, she just began to acknowledge her own brother and wanted to go to Beeford City to visit her late parents. Kevin Kyle decided to go with her. On the way back to the Beeford City, George Ken briefly told Karen Daly about the Ken family. Herbert Ken's closest relative was his brother. After Herbert Ken's accident, George Ken lived in his uncle's house and grew up with his daughter. His uncle's family treated him well, and he had a good relationship with his cousin. They were just like a brother and sister. After listening to it, Karen Daly was full of emotions. Actually, there were still many families with love in this world. When they arrived in the Beeford City, Karen Daly first went to visit Herbert Ken's burial site, and then paid her respects to her late mother. Standing in front of her mother's tombstone and looking at the cold stone tablet, Karen Daly could not help but think of the past and her mother, who was smiling so happily in the photo. Karen Daly found out that when her mother smiled, she smiled so beautifully and happily. Her mother must be very happy at that time. Karen Daly's impression of her mother was that she was obedient. Every time, after Samuel Daly beat and scolded her mother, all that her mother could do was to sob in the room. Karen Daly had never known that her mother had such a beautiful love story. There used to be a man who held her mother in high regard and loved her. However, those beautiful days were too short. When her mother was about to marry her childhood sweetheart, she was raped by Samuel Daly, the inhumane beast. Karen Daly's mother wanted to call the police, but she was stopped by her family. They thought that this was a shame on the family name. They persuaded her mother to hide this matter and never talk about it to others, especially to the Ken family. However, it was the first time for her timid mother to go against her family's wishes. She secretly found Herbert Ken and proposed to break up with him. She even lied to her family that she had already told Herbert Ken that she had lost her virginity. In the end, her family was furious and forced her to marry Samuel Daly. It was the beginning of her mother's nightmare. She lived a miserable life for years. In the end, her mother committed suicide to protect her from future threats of Samuel Daly and ended her miserable life. If her mother had not been raped by Samuel Daly and had not been forced to marry that beast by her family, then her fate would have been different. Her mother would be living a happy life with Karen's biological father. But no one could turn back time. Everything changed when Samuel Daly showed up in front of her mother. Samuel Daly changed her mother's life and Karen Daly's life, but Karen Daly was luckier than her mother. She met Kevin Kyle, a man whom she could rely on for the rest of her life. Perhaps it was because she was more stubborn than her mother. She would not allow anyone to control her life, so she had the opportunity to meet Kevin Kyle. Karen Daly took a deep breath, and Kevin Kyle immediately held her waist. His low and sexy voice sounded in her ear. Karen, you must live a happy life. That's what my mother-in-law wants to see the most. Karen Daly looked back at him. His face was always so handsome. His eyes were sharp. His glasses look made him exude an elegant temperament. He was so perfect that he would catch people's breath away. Karen Daly couldn't believe that she had such an excellent husband. Karen Daly held Kevin Kyle's hand and looked towards her mother's tombstone. She said, Mom, do you see this? This man has always been very kind to me, and I will be happy forever. We all know that you are very happy because Matthew loves you very much, so don't show off in front of me, who is still single. George Ken, who stood behind them, suddenly said. Karen Daly turned around and raised her eyebrows with a smile. Then you'd better find me a sister-in-law as soon as possible. At that time, you can show off in front of me too. Women are all troubled creatures. I don't want to get myself into trouble. George Ken glanced at Kevin Kyle and said, Look at this man beside you. He used to be a very cold man, but now he has completely become a slave of his wife. It's my pleasure, Kevin Kyle said calmly. His appearance was still so cold that no one dared to approach him, but his gaze was much softer. Okay, whatever floats your boat. 2 days ago, after seeing Kevin Kyle's ruthless means, George Ken's shoulder was still hurting, so he had to be careful cracking jokes. After paying tributes to the parents, they had a meal with George Ken and were ready to go back to Chatterton Town. Before he left, George Ken held Karen Daly's hand and said, Karen, no matter when, if you need my help, come to me. Yes, I will. Thank you, brother. Karen Daly nodded and gave George Ken a hug. She rubbed at her brother's chest, and she almost shed tears. For some reason, she seemed to be more and more emotional recently. Don't thank me. In fact, I'm just too free. I always want someone to find something to trouble me. Now that I've finally found the right person, I should thank you. George Ken patted Karen Daly's back and let her out of his arms. He did not want to hug any longer. Kevin Kyle, who was next to him, looked at him with a gloomy look again. Brother-in-law, take good care of my sister in the future. If my father and Karen's mom were here, they would thank you as well. Before Kevin Kyle would take her away, George Ken gently pushed Karen Daly toward him. Karen is my wife, Kevin Kyle said in a deep voice. Of course, he would take good care of his wife, and Kevin Kyle doesn't need to be told. Aren't you two classmates and good friends? Karen Daly glanced at the two men in front of her and said with a smile, Why are you guys talking with much sarcasm now? Let's go. It's almost time to board the plane. Kevin Kyle left with Karen Daly in his arms. He didn't even want to say goodbye to George Ken. Karen Daly turned around and waved her hand. As she walked, she said, Brother, bye. Welcome to Chatterton Town if you have time. Okay, see you soon. George Ken waved at her and stood where he was, watching them leave. It was his father's wish to reconcile Karen Daly. Now that he had done it for his father would be able to leave with peace. Mr. Kyle, why do I feel that you are getting pettier each day? Karen Daly pulled Kevin Kyle and said with some amusement. George Ken was her brother, and Kevin Kyle was the one that asked them to reconcile. Why was he jealous? Kevin Kyle had nothing to say. It was not because he became pettier and pettier, but because he cared more and more for her. He couldn't even bear the thought of losing her. These were the thoughts in Kevin Kyle's mind, but he wouldn't say it out loud. Although he had tried his best to change a lot during this period of time, he was still Kevin Kyle, who didn't know how to talk sweetly with others. Chapter 185. Kevin Kyle and Karen Daly had just returned to Chatterton Town when Kevin Kyle received a call from Mia Kyle, saying that the elders of the Kyle family had already arrived home. Grandpa Kyle was very angry when he heard that Kevin Kyle was running around with Karen Daly, who was pregnant. Everyone was cautious around him. Every time when Grandpa Kyle was angry, Mia Kyle would be able to make him happy soon. But this time, he was really angry. Mia Kyle waited at the door of the house for a long time. Finally, when Kevin Kyle's car arrived, she ran over and said, Brother, Grandpa is angry, so you should be careful when you talk to him. Don't provoke him. The Kyle family knew that Grandpa Kyle does not get angry often, but when he started to get angry, no one could stop him. After all, he was the eldest of the Kyle family, and he had his own ego. Everyone respected him. Hearing that Grandpa Kyle was coming, Karen Daly subconsciously held Kevin Kyle's hand tightly and looked at him with some concern. It's okay, don't worry. Kevin Kyle thought Karen Daly was worried that he would be scolded by his grandfather, so he patted her hand and comforted her. Okay. Karen Daly did not say anything else. She held Kevin Kyle's hand tightly and followed him. When they returned to the living room, the family looked at them immediately. Kevin Kyle's mother's face looked terrible. It seemed that it was caused by the long journey and that she didn't have a good rest. Kevin Kyle's father's attention was focused on Mama Kyle, and he did not look good either. He was worried about Mama Kyle. There was no expression on Grandpa Kyle's face, but it could be seen that his anger was suppressed in his heart. Karen Daly and Kevin Kyle were the younger ones in the house, so they should naturally take the initiative to greet the elders. When Kevin Kyle was about to speak, Grandpa Kyle said, Matthew, your wife has been pregnant for 7 months, and you still take her around. What if there was something wrong with her and the child? What do you think we should do then? Grandpa Kyle's words were meant for Kevin Kyle. Perhaps everyone thought that he was lecturing Kevin Kyle, but Karen Daly knew that Grandpa Kyle was talking to her. Kevin Kyle said in a low voice, "Grandpa, the doctor said that the baby is in good condition." Kevin Kyle cared about Karen Daly and the baby in her belly more than anyone else. If it was dangerous, he would certainly not bring Karen Daly around. The baby is in good condition? Don't you know what is an accident? Grandpa Kyle's loud voice echoed in the room. Dad, Karen has come back safely now. Don't get angry. Kevin Kyle's father quickly helped his son and daughter-in-law. Grandpa Kyle said discontentedly, "Can't I be concerned for my great-grandson and granddaughter-in-law?" Grandpa, I will pay attention in the future. I won't go around before giving birth to the baby again. Karen Daly secretly glanced at Grandpa Kyle's face and said cautiously, "Well, I know you are a sensible child. It's Matthew's good fortune to be able to marry you," said Grandpa Kyle. Karen Daly understood the implied meaning behind Grandpa Kyle's words, while everyone else probably took his literal meaning. What Grandpa Kyle really wanted to say was that she was not sensible, because she did not leave Kevin Kyle as what Grandpa Kyle had asked. Instead, she was pregnant with Kevin Kyle's child. Grandpa Kyle didn't take any action for a few months. Now that they met again, he still looked like the kind Grandpa Kyle on the surface, but no one knew what he was thinking. Karen Daly guessed that Grandpa Kyle might want to keep the bloodline of the Kyle family. After she gave birth to the baby, he would force her to leave Kevin Kyle. Grandpa Kyle might have underestimated her. She was not willing to leave Kevin Kyle the moment she knew she was pregnant, and she will never be willing to leave. Karen Daly quietly raised her head and looked at Grandpa Kyle. She happened to meet Grandpa Kyle's gaze. His gaze was sharp and frightening, but he quickly concealed it. Grandpa Kyle pretended that nothing had happened, and Karen Daly pretended that nothing had happened. She smiled and said, "Thank you, Grandpa. Grandpa, I have a lot to tell you during this period of time. You should listen to me first." Mia Kyle held Grandpa Kyle's hand and acted like a spoiled child. In fact, she wanted to help her brother and sister-in-law out. Well, tell me, Mia, what story do you have recently?" Only Mia Kyle could make Grandpa Kyle smile so kindly. "Dad, Mom." Karen Daly greeted Kevin Kyle's parents again. Kevin's mom patted the seat beside her and let Karen Daly sit next to her. She took her hand and said, "Karen, you've been through a lot these days." Karen Daly shook her head and said, "Mom, I'm fine. But you don't look well. Why don't you go back to your room and have a rest for a while?" "Well, just some old problems. I easily get sick." Speaking of her physical condition, Kevin's mother glanced at her husband again. He was the one who worked harder than her over the years. Although it was her who was sick, he was the one that was worried about her. Every time when she was in poor health, Kevin's father would be more anxious than her. "Don't force yourself. Go back to the room with me to rest first." Kevin's father helped his wife up and said to Karen Daly, "Karen, you are also tired. You should go to rest for a while. Mia will accompany Grandpa Kyle." "Okay." Karen Daly stood up and wanted to help support Mama Kyle, but was stopped by Kevin Kyle. He held her hand and led her back to the room. "Why do you look sick?" "Maybe I'm tired. I'll take a shower and sleep for a while." Karen Daly couldn't tell Kevin Kyle that she was afraid of Grandpa Kyle. That's why her face looked so terrible. Ouch. Hearing Karen Daly's voice, Kevin Kyle hurried to hold her and nervously asked, "What's wrong?" "Shh, Kevin, don't make a noise." Karen Daly stood still and seemed to feel something in silence. After a few seconds, she took Kevin Kyle's hand and put it on her round belly. She said excitedly, "Kevin, do you feel it? The baby just kicked me." "Really? The baby kicked me a few times." Kevin Kyle said nervously, "Really? Does it hurt a lot?" Karen Daly responded, "It won't hurt. It's so amazing." Kevin Kyle immediately lowered his head and put his ears on Karen Daly's round belly. As soon as he put them on, he felt that the baby kicked him. He smiled and said, "Karen, I feel it too." He smiled happily, revealing a mouthful of white and neat teeth, like a youthful boy. In the past, when he smiled, he was very reserved. If you didn't pay attention, you couldn't see his smile at all. This was the first time that Karen Daly saw him laughing so happily, so she couldn't move her eyes away. Kevin Kyle did not notice her silly look. He put his hand on her belly and listened to it. He said, "Baby, be good. Don't kick your mother." Looking at Kevin Kyle's silly look, Karen Daly smiled and said, "Mr. Kyle, you look so cute. Let me tell you, actually, the baby is not kicking me. It may have woken up and stretched herself."